Today's talk is a bit different from the others because this time it's a sort of round circle discussion, and we have people to talk about rebellions that have happened around the world, and not just exile, not just climate rebellions, but we've got Paula to talk to us about what's been happening in Chile, Moa to talk to us about the unrest in India, and we have artists from the Hong Kong protest show Freedom High, which is on at the Vault Festival at the moment, to talk about Hong Kong. And I'm going to ask Paula to kick off.
Thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. We are living a rather special moment in our lifetimes, I think. As a species, we haven't faced an epidemic of this kind for a very long time, and this is the first time for anybody in our lives. I find the setting quite appropriate. We're now in a bunker. And it reminded me of Camus. In one of his books, The Plague, he says, "The plague never dies." Obviously, he was speaking about fascism. But what we are facing today at world scale is also a man-made catastrophe. It's not fascism, but it's unbridled capitalism and what it has brought on our planet. So I'm going to speak about Chile, which is a specific case in this story. And I think we are, it's quite an interesting case because as a country that is very much at the extremes and on the margins, we are a kind of canary in the mine, if you wish. Climate change has already been affecting Chile for a very long time, directly in a way people can feel in their everyday life. I come from a small town in the south of Chile where 30 years ago we used to have 5,000 millimeters of rain per year. As a reference, the UK has got about 880 millimeters. So we are a very rainy place. Well, now that very rainy place only has half of that rainfall. That's 2,500, which is still a lot, but it's a huge change for our environment. This change has been happening all over the country. So to this point, that vineyards are moving south nowadays. It's like they're moving north in Europe. We have been suffering huge droughts, and we have big conflicts around water rights and water use. So what I'm going to speak about today is Chile as a case where climate change and the environmental crisis brought by a model of exploitation that is totally disrespectful both of natural environments but also of the humans that inhabit the territory is pushing the social and political crisis that the country is facing at the moment. So since October 2019, as you probably all know, we've been having a very strong social uprising with very strong demonstrations and demands to many social and economical demands, but in particular a demand for a new constitution. Now, although this is a case that is very specific to Chile, I think it's once again very exemplary of situations around the world, because why are people so mad about the constitution, and how did a very general expression of social anger coalesce so fast into a demand for a constitutional change? It did because our constitution was written under the dictatorship, and it enshrined the absolute primacy of property rights over human rights, over ecological and environmental rights, over social rights. It also means that no political change is possible in my country because any law to be passed requires 4/5 of the parliament to vote for an approval, at more than 4/5 of the parliament, which has made any real social change impossible since the beginning of the democracy. So what happened is that, and this is something that has happened in different ways in the rest of the world, is that politics, in the proper sense, as the decisions we made in common to rule our house, have been taken out of politics. It has become we change characters in a commedia buffa. We change the people who run the castle, but we do not. There is no real political alternative, because real political alternative is in our case just really absolutely not possible as long as we don't change this constitution. So our fight at the moment is concentrated on that, because we cannot do anything about the exploitation of our waters and of our mineral resources, and the way they've been overexploited, the way the water is privatized. So some areas today don't have waters for animals to drink or for even people in the tap, because all the water has been given as a priority to the avocado farms. Our sea is being destroyed because our coastal areas, because the salmon farming is a very powerful lobby and is at very high intensity. It's destroying the coastal waters and coastal areas. So there are many regions where the only fish that you can find is escaped salmon. Same in what we call the áreas de sacrificio, which are the sacrifice zones, because the state does not actually really supervise contamination on the state of the water, and there is much corruption in that. We have what we consider to be 5 zones of sacrifice, meaning that the pollution is so bad that everything, the air, the soil, the water are toxic. And we have an explosion of cancer rates and sick children with respiratory diseases and other complications. So we are, as a country, at a crux point where hopefully things will change seriously. But right now, as this happens, we are facing this coronavirus crisis, and there's been, from next week onwards, all congregations of more than 500 people will be forbidden. So I was actually... There's one question I wanted to ask from the Hong Kong activists is, how have you managed to keep the momentum going in spite of the epidemic? Have you managed to keep the momentum going? That's a question I will actually like to hear you answer. So Chile is a prosperous country that is a member of this OCDE, the only one in South America, which makes us sound like we are something close to Poland or Portugal. We are not. We are a country whose GDP is mainly dependent on extractivist activities. So obviously everybody knows about the copper, but there's also lithium, gold, rare earths, and many others. This model is not only very destructive from an environmental point of view, it also doesn't leave much in the country. Chile charges much lower royalties to mining companies than Australia does. Nobody will call Australia a socialist country. Yet, very little of the riches produced by the mineral extraction remains in the country. That is something that has to be addressed, together with a better control of the exploitation process. And in the north, in some areas, we have some good news. The indigenous communities have become very empowered and are being very successful at challenging mining companies. They have won some settlements that have awarded them tens of millions of dollars, and in one case, I think $100 million, which allows them now to employ mining experts and scientists and lawyers to better defend their rights. This is far from over. We just lost a very big fight, the Pascual Lama mining project that is run by Barrick. The project was stopped, but it will now resume. It endangers glaciers. More than 20 hectares of glaciers will be endangered. We started winning, and now that we have a momentum, we are very worried about what's going to happen, because the reaction is very strong. The repression of the social movement has been very brutal. We have more than 400 people with ocular wounds. I think Chile has been, unfortunately, holds a record in the number of ocular wounds in protests, because it's been a systematic policy. We have more than 1,600 people held in prison, of which more than 300 children, minors. We have systematic use of torture and violence, and often sexual torture and rape against people who are arrested, women but not only. So we are running into this very difficult moment in which things could happen. But we are really scared that we could also face a very violent backlash from the army, in particular if the crisis carries on for a long time. Because at the moment we have a big momentum, but people might get scared, especially if the effects of the epidemics and an economic crisis are associated. We are really worried that what we have won and the progress that we've done so far might be really scaled back. I could speak a lot more about the different aspects of the extractivist economy. So the mining is one wing, but the others are forestry products. Chile is a big forestry country. So this is imported species that are from an environmental point of view, are very dangerous because they destroy all the natural habitats, and they don't keep carbon on the soil, unlike natural forests. And the other aspect, obviously, is the sea, what I mentioned before about salmon farming. There is a brilliant movie that was made some years ago by a Norwegian journalist about the salmon industry in Chile. It shows how because in Norway the limitations and the regulations are quite strong, although they've had serious pollution and contamination issues. The Norwegian companies and American companies expanded the business in the south of Chile that had ideal conditions, because we have more than 1,000 kilometers of fjords with relatively temperate waters. We had a very big shock in 2010 when an epidemic that arrived from Norway, actually, in a batch of smolt, destroyed the industry for 4 or 5 years. I used to live there at that time, and my husband and I lost our jobs because of this epidemic, and we had to move. And this is allowed to happen because of the model of ownership of the soil and the waters. In Chile, you can actually obtain a sea concession from the government, which is essentially free, apart from an impact study, which is a joke. But more interesting than that is that once you have this right, it's like a property title, like a land deed, and it can be traded on the open market. So there's a market for these titles. So you get the property of a shared resource, water, in this case the sea, but it's the same for land waters, for nothing. And then it becomes a commodity that you can trade on the open market. And it also gives you exploitation rights that are defined but not controlled, which means that everybody, all the farming industry overcrowds fish in pens, which is terrible for the fish also, but also it's hugely contaminating because a fish farm pollutes as much as a pig farm. And we all know the consequences of heavy pig farming, how contaminating they are for groundwaters. And this farming happens in a closed sea and in fjords, where the water renews very, very slowly. So we are contaminating these areas, and they will not be decontaminated for hundreds of years. And this is a little bit, and the farming industry is a little bit of a metaphor for the extractivist industry in Chile. It's farming pigs in our backyards. And that's what we're fighting, and we hope to be able to carry on the fight in solidarity with people from other countries.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm going to be just reading off my phone for a while because there are many points I'd like to cover. So I'm Moa from South Asian Students Against Fascism. And before beginning, I'd like to say that I'm immensely grateful for having been given this opportunity and privilege to share a space with these wonderful people, and who I'm sure are far more experienced in addressing panels and discussions than I am. And having said that, I would also like to add that I am here on behalf of an amazing group of people who have been a large part of my life for the last few months as we have struggled together and mobilized against the violent authoritarian regime of Narendra Modi in India. I'm here not just to share, but also more importantly to learn from the other panelists, so that I may return and share a message with my comrades from SASAF of how we can build international solidarity through collective struggles. I must also acknowledge, being here, my caste and caste privilege, which has allowed me to be here in London and to speak about injustice that many in India have been resisting for decades in many different ways. Women, Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims, queer and trans communities are systematically denied spaces to voice their resistance against the hegemony of Brahmanical patriarchy that is entrenched in Indian society, of which what we see today as Hindutva fascism is just the most visible and probably the most explicit form. To set some context, I'd like to say that, I mean, since 2014 in India, the Bharatiya Janata Party under Narendra Modi has been in power, and this is a Hindu nationalist party that is a right wing party, and they have developed over their support over the years through consolidating the Hindu population by creating a sort of hatred against Muslims. And the ideologues of this party come from an organization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the RSS. And this is a large non-governmental organization which was started before independence. And the ideologues of this organization borrowed a lot from Hitler's Nazi Germany in terms of their ideas of ethnic purity, and they sympathized with their practices of Hitler's idea of the final solution, in India in terms of othering the Muslim community. And a lot of the big leaders from the BJP have come to power on the back of violent pogroms and genocide against Muslims. For example, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the Prime Minister, became prominent after a terrible speech that he made, which led to the Nelly massacre in Assam. You have Advani and Murli Manohar Joshi, who led the Rath Yatra, which was a campaign to destroy the Babri Masjid, an old mosque in Ayodhya, on some vague claims that this particular space was where Lord Ram, who is a Hindu deity, was born. And then we have now Narendra Modi, who was largely responsible for the 2002 communal violence against Muslims in Gujarat, and is now the Prime Minister of this country. But of course, having said that, I mean, India has a long history, which is kind of different from Chile, where the Constitution was a document that was written in a very progressive mind. It was written by Dr. Ambedkar, and it was something that he said was something we need to strive towards, that at the day that we got independence did not mean that we had a nation. All that was there was a state, but in order to build a nation, we would have to address the deep-rooted social inequalities that have been historically plaguing Indian society. For example, caste and of course class as well. And so we have a long history of struggle in India in terms of the environment movement. In different places, people have opposed various measures of the state. For example, we have the state has a big project of energy extraction, and there is a river Narmada, where people had organized to stop the construction of a large dam under the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And there is also the Niyamgiri example of where the Dongriya Kond Adivasis resisted against Vedanta, which is a large mining company, and successfully protected their hill, which is a deity for them, and in which there were large reserves of bauxite. To kind of tie this into the context of climate change and environment, in India it's very complex, because you have this Narendra Modi who is projected a lot as someone who cares for the environment because of his vegetarianism and his championing of supposed green energy, clean energy. But we have to look at this in the sense of vegetarianism being a caste practiced by Brahmins, and having resulted in a lot of violence for lower caste and Muslims in India. For example, 2 years ago, the government put a ban in cow slaughter in many states. And what this did is it enabled a lot of young vigilantes to go out and to lynch Muslims who were in the trade of like trading cattle, who and it was normalized by the state because party leaders would felicitate these vigilantes in public events. People there was evidence of them having gone and killed people on the streets. So while we talk about not eating beef and not eating and being vegetarian, we have to look at the other side of the violence in the way that it is being meted out in India. On the other hand, nowadays it's very fancy for people to eat different kinds of grains and millets. Like, for example, in India, there is ragi, which is finger millet, and this is something that people have that farmers have relied on as a source of food, but the demands of the market and of export have pushed people away from this, and now because of organic farming and trying to eat different kinds of grains, there's a resurgence of ragi, which has forced people to grow ragi under highly stressed conditions, and this has in fact pushed a lot of these farmers for whom ragi was their food into severe distress, which is so ironic because this food is taken away from them and then made into their oppressor. Also in India, we have Coal India, which is one of the 10 largest carbon emitting companies in the world. So you have a great paradox of struggle as well as the state supporting large extractive companies. So, but currently we're dealing with fascism, which is an extreme form of violence in which Muslims have been systematically targeted in two different ways. One was the amendment to our Citizenship Act, which was done in December, which made religion a criteria for citizenship in the country. And this is very serious because this has never been done before, but it allows people from 5 religions, except Muslims, to seek citizenship in the country. And this was done in the context of a national register of citizens, an exercise that was done in a state of India in which 1.9 million people were excluded and not recognized as citizens of the country. People who have worked in the country for many years, given their lives in the service as well in the government, are not acknowledged. And the CAA was done with the specific aim of excluding the Muslims from this group of 1.9 million excluded people so that they would not receive citizenship. And there has been talk of implementing this law across the country, which would ultimately disenfranchise Muslims all over the country. And this kind of systematic process is part of a form of dehumanizing, and it has led to a lot of resistance, huge protests all over the country, people saying that this is not all right. This constitution protects all communities because we recognize that it is a secular nation, but at the same time this is happening. And what we have had in Delhi, in Shaheen Bagh, a very long sit-in since December, which is now in its 3rd month. Today is March 15th. Since December 15th, women have been sitting there through the winter, 24 hours, and this has been a huge movement. And across India, in different cities, Muslim women are coming out to assert their Indian identity, saying that they belong to this country and this country belongs to them. And what came out of this was an extremely violent reaction from the BJP, and they enabled Hindu mobs to go into parts of northeast Delhi last month, and in which 53 people or more and counting have lost their lives, have been killed in this. and this was a targeted violence against Muslims, against working class Muslims, some of whom who were not even part of the protests, who were going about their regular lives, but were picked up off the streets and killed by these mobs. This is the current situation in India, and Narendra Modi, who is the Prime Minister, presides over this nation as if nothing is going on. And I'd like to mention that, I mean, fascism can, just to conclude, can very easily coexist with kind of rhetoric of green energy, renewable energy, because last year, Narendra Modi was felicitated by the UN with the Champions of the Earth Award, which was one of the highest supposed honors for like environment by the UN, and this was for starting something called the International Solar Alliance, and this whole thing was promoted on a rhetoric of maximization and efficiency of getting as much solar energy as possible, which completely overlooks any sort of notions of justice in terms of energy. Because if we're talking about climate change, and we're talking about clean energy, we have to also talk about justice and how people have access to this energy, whether it is just being something that is owned by private companies, or is it actually going to benefit the people who live in these countries. Because as we are seeing now, this is just more pandering to like the international neoliberal kind of establishment, and it does not seem to speak to the needs and the violence that is meted out to the people in India every day.
I'd just like to introduce the cast of Freedom High, because I'm the director of Freedom High, and I've asked them very last minute to step up to cover for Jessie Lau, who is a Hong Kong journalist who sadly couldn't join us today. So I know that you've been prepping what you're going to say just a few moments ago, but I'm very, very grateful to our cast for helping us out today. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hi everyone, I'm Gabby, I'm from Hong Kong.
Hello, I'm John, I'm from Hong Kong.
Hi, I'm Bonnie, I'm also from Hong Kong.
Yes, as Kim has just said, it was really last minute, and what we are saying are mostly from our own personal experience and what we know and learn from each other, from news outlet and from scientists and academics who has been publishing papers. So we may not be providing the most accurate information, but we are trying our best to show the truth that we know.
I'd just like to say today is actually the 1-year anniversary of the start of the protests, the 15th of March. So it's been going on for a year and we haven't stopped yet.
So these kind of images of tear gas filling the city, the center of the city, these spaces that we always pass by, we always know, has been on the news since last year, June, and it has also happened in 2014 during the Umbrella Revolution, and it has now become almost like the normal landscape of Hong Kong, which is really tragic. And we would like to first start from talking about the consequences of these tear gases. These tear gases are obviously toxic, and the component that is toxic within it is called 1,4-dioxide. And this kind of chemical material has been proved to be staying on surfaces for quite a long time unless someone go in and clean them. One of the really serious and one of the really most talked about incident is when the police fire a tear gas canister into Kwai Fong Underground Station, which is called MTR Station in Hong Kong, and it's an enclosed environment, which means the tear gas has nowhere to disperse, which means the toxic material would be stayed on these surfaces forever, unless someone go in and clean them. And what really amazing that happened right after that is that people put on masks, put on gloves, and go into this MTR station and start cleaning these surfaces by themselves. For those who are saying that protesters were being paid to go to protest, would you go and risk your life and clean the surfaces with dioxide like this? Unless you love your city so much and you love your fellow citizens so much that you would do this. I mean, just look at this bucket of water, which is horrible.
And to add to this point, a lot of these tear gas canisters are actually outdated. They are like they expired already, like a few years, but police are still using them, not like taking anything into an account, like people's life and also like of course the environment itself into account. So it's really, really harmful to like our environment, not only to people's health but also to the environment and all wildlife as well. There are like birds found dead in the street, like almost everywhere in Hong Kong, like after a few days of one of these incidents happened. And to give a number of like how many tear gas the police had fired, like in some of these incidents, they fired over 1,458 cannons in one single day. So it's been a year now, like since June they started use tear gas. So you can imagine how many, like there's like tens of thousands of tear gas being fired in Hong Kong.
So human can walk away, but animals can't quite, especially in this case where the dogs are on duty with their police. So you can see the policeman is wearing tear gas mask, is wearing all kind of protective gear, but the dog has nothing. So the animal welfare in the protests and in the social chaos has also been quite a topic. As Bonnie has just said, there are also reports of, there are also, I can't quite Google, but there are a lot of photos that birds found dead on the streets right after tear gas canister was fired a day ago, and no one can really prove how harmful are these materials to the wildlife, as it's really hard to do any statistic, and our government has been refusing to open what is the component of this tear gas exactly. And there has been a paper written by Emily Chen on the medical journal Lancet about the use of tear gas for crowd control in Hong Kong, about how dangerous is it, which I recommend everyone to go and look at, they prove a lot.
Yeah, and to just to talk about like the government, how they are considerate about the environment, I can like talk about more about how their policies are very lag behind, like environmental protection policy. It's very lag behind when compared to like nearby region, for example, like Taiwan. The recycling policy is really good, and for example, like in Japan as well. In Hong Kong, we have nothing. The government kind of like try to encourage people. Oh, okay, you have to recycle stuff, different colored bins. That you have to bin your paper in different bins. But actually, because they are like now contracting everything, like outsourcing everything and like subcontracting everything, and nobody's taking care of all these recycling bins. There are like multiple cases, like everyone in Hong Kong knows that no one's going to recycle these. They just mix everything back together and just dump it in the landfills. So that's why a lot of Hong Kong people like, okay, the government's not doing anything. They start to like be more aware and try to do it themselves. So there are people nowadays, like more people are aware of these, are like using recyclable Tupperwares and stuff like that, and also like they're trying to manage to organize their own recycling centers in the community, in the different communities as well. Another thing about protecting the environment, it's about, because John earlier mentioned when we were discussing about this, tear gas hasn't been like fired in some more rural area in Hong Kong. For example, like my family live in northeastern part of Hong Kong.
So this air pollution test, the redder it is, the more dioxide there are in the air, and you can see Hong Kong is known to be a very developed city. However, actually more than 40% of the land in Hong Kong still remain as rural, because Hong Kong is a very mountainous and hilly city, and you can see the green area happened also to be the green area in Hong Kong. So there's almost a metaphor of refuge from the nature that is happening in Hong Kong.
But because the government is paying more attention in economic development than like protecting the environment, they are like kind of like wanting to like erase all these green places in Hong Kong. Where I live, it's outside my village, like right in front of our doorstep, is a place called Long Mei Tan. It's a Long Mei it's called beach, but it's actually a mangrove mud flat. So it's full of different wildlife, and it's very vibrant in biodiversity. But then, like 4 or 5 years ago, the government decided to move. It's ridiculous, but they try to like move all these animals to migrate them into like on the side, and so that they can clear a piece of land to build a man-made beach, artificial beach, for people to enjoy the environment. It's ridiculous. We've been protesting against it for years, and also like a lot of biologists and also environmental activists are like saying that they have been like doing research of how many different wildlife are living there, and unique wildlife as well. There are unique species, like over 100 unique species there in that beach. But the government still pushed that policy ahead. And now when I go back home, it's a piece of land filled with
nothingness,
sand, and barred away with boards and stuff under construction already.
The policy was made in 2007, and the beach was finished in 2010.
The beach is not finished yet.
It just.
But the policy, it started to happen now.
So I think you were asking how the struggle in Hong Kong has continued. One of the things that we were discussing earlier before was that because anyone who thinks about Hong Kong, they always think like rampant capitalism. However, because there is such a mistrust for the government that there's a whole new economy that's happening. So there's the pro-establishment side, which we call the blue ribbons, and then there's the pro-democracy side, which we call the yellow ribbons. And there's all these apps and all these sharing information of which small business who tends to be the more progressive businesses who support local produce or more recyclable or more zero waste sort of practices are more yellow. So people are actually going to those businesses more and is actually supporting the small businesses. And the blue ribboned big businesses are suffering. They are literally suffering. So money actually does talk, but in a good way this time.
Yeah, it's called the yellow economic circle. People are trying to build this database of what small businesses belong to this circle. So we encourage people to help them and to buy things from them, and so as to help the economy as well.
I think one thing to mention, which is really important, is how symbols and graphic has been very important in our revolution. Like these characters has been always in protest graphics, on posters, on social media promotion.
In our show.
Yeah, in our show. And then another thing about the yellow and blue ribbon, which is really magnificent, I think, is about we have had district council election last November. And then, so this is a comparison. This is a comparison between 2015 and 2019, the results of that. And you can see how the yellow take much more constituency right after the revolution. Yeah. Do you want to talk about Freedom High?
Right, okay. Yeah, so our show is called Freedom High, and it's, I'm going to swear, it's 自由嗨 in Cantonese, which means freedom cunt. It was a term that was given to the police, given by the police to the protesters, saying "you freedom cunts" or that stuff. And a bunch of feminists have kind of reclaimed it. And one of our wonderful characters in the show, Puss, she tells everyone to free your cunt. So there is a sense of not quite there yet, but there is a sort of green shoot of feminism that's happening within the protest too, because there are actually quite a lot of sexual violence towards female protesters.
I'd let you speak a lot longer than I said we would, because it's so fascinating. So we have about 10 minutes to wrap up.
I'm sorry, my presentation was a bit disorganized. I didn't have much time to prep. I had a family funeral yesterday also, so I've been a little bit out of it. So I first wanted to tell everybody that I am actually not standing here for myself. I'm a member of an organization in London called Assemblea Chilena in Londres, which is an organization of Chileans in London who are supporting the protest and fighting for human rights in Chile, and all that comes together. And I wanted to do a remark about to build on what you said about the feminism. One of the deep triggers of the current uprising is actually the feminist movement, because Chile was, a few years ago, anybody would have spoken about uprising, and we all just say, "Are you crazy? Such things don't happen in Chile. We just eat it up and go to the mall and buy some more clothes." And yeah, I get more in depth, but it had started before Me Too, with Ni Una Menos, which is quite a different spin on feminism, because it's we stand together, so we won't allow another one to die or to be raped. And then Me Too really went in, especially in the universities, and we had university takeovers, occupation by the female students for like a year and a half. And that started not only the university, but also in the high school, in factories, a very big discussion and movements that were really the base for what came afterwards. And it changed a lot of things in society. It changed the way people position themselves. So I thought it was interesting that feminism is something that's coming up in yours, and whereas for us it's really at the core of the protest.
Actually, the original speaker for Hong Kong, Jessie, she's written a really interesting piece about why the Me Too movement in Hong Kong hasn't quite taken off. And it's, I mean, as a feminist and from Hong Kong, it makes me really sad that it hasn't been quite taken on board. But I think young women in Hong Kong are feeling the brunt of it, and they're getting angry now, so...
I didn't speak much about Kashmir. I did speak a little bit about in the Northeast, and these are parts of India that have never been really Indian, and they have been resisting this kind of imposition of India upon them in Kashmir since 1947. And in August last year, the state initiated a complete shutdown and a communication blockade in Kashmir, and Kashmiris were completely isolated and not able to contact their families, and it was a state of absolute fear for so many of these people. And in Kashmir, there's been a history of violence against women, state violence against women. There was the incident of Kunan Poshpara, where the twin villages Kunan and Poshpara, the army went in there and cordoned off the villages and separated the men and the women, and there have been reports of mass rapes of women from these two villages. And while there are so many examples of violence against women by the state in India, women in Kunan Poshpara, women from Kashmir have been resisting against this, trying to find some recognition of this, of what happened, in just filing a first information report in the police station. Like, this is the first step to see that the state recognizes what it has done to the women, and they are fighting even now. I think when we are resisting, we have to talk about the systematic ways in which patriarchy kind of lives in the state, and how women face doubly like the oppression.
We are all people of the diaspora here. The Chilean diaspora is not very big, but we have enough residents like me, and we have a number of students also who have been very, very active and at the core of this movement. So we're essentially, in our case, we have the old survivors of exile here, many of which are still very active. We have some women in particular who are in their 70s, in their late 60s or 70s, who are themselves survivors of political prison, in Pinochet's political prison, and they're still coming to demonstrations with us and doing events with us, which is absolutely amazing. They're the living soul of the movement, really. I mean, they have an experience, they have a lived experience of this, but also an organizational experience that is huge. And around that, there's a looser core of people also who are transient here because they come for 5-6 months, we came together very fast because what was happening was very shocking. In particular, Chile didn't expect to have to face again these kind of situations of torture and violence. We thought we had put this behind. I find that we have very active cores in the diaspora, but the majority is quite silent. I don't know what's the experience in the other diasporas, but there is a lot of sympathy. So we generally, for important posts, and particularly live broadcasts, we get over 1,000 people sharing and watching in the UK. But participation it's important in the measure that we do get 200 people at events and things like that, but we don't get beyond that. So we are not a very big diaspora too, but we have more than 10,000 people in the UK. So yeah, that's our experience.
I think there is there's a large Indian diaspora, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And in fact, Modi and the BJP has relied a lot on support from the diaspora, not just political support, but also financial support. Large amounts of money have been flowing from diaspora to support the campaigns, the political campaigns of the BJP. Having said that, there are some of us who are here. I mean, I'm here as a student, and there are others who do organize, and we actually do find a lot of, I think, strength and solidarity in reaching out to diaspora communities from other countries. Like, for example, we recently organized an action along with some people from Brazil to resist against fascism, which is happening in Brazil as well as in India with Bolsonaro. And as well, when we attend these kind of events and hear about oppression that people are facing in Hong Kong and in Chile and in so many parts of in the world, and I think that is something that, at least for me personally, I find to be a great source of strength, because even if people from the Indian diaspora may be largely apathetic or maybe even on the other side, kind of lost in that kind of discourse of hate, we do find a lot of strength in this, I think. So yeah.
There's a huge wave of rallies supporting Hong Kong everywhere around the world. I think one of the very strong characteristics of Hong Kong is the ability to self-organize something and start to innovate, to be creative, to be very articulate. We're all very individual, but when it comes to time of crisis, we come together really quickly, and we are able to articulate a message very, very powerfully. So protest is a way, and then shows like all these creative performances and all the poster that we're making is a way. And in London, there's also an exhibition, a touring exhibition called Liberate Hong Kong, which is a touring exhibition that happened already in 5 different universities around London.
I would actually add also that having been on these marches and then also gone on other marches in solidarity with the Uyghur community as well as the Tibetan community, we sort of the common oppressor, the state that we're fighting against, is complete state control, and it is happening around the world, which is really evident. So I think, like, as diasporas, we come together in that way that we know that there's a common enemy. That sounds really trite, but yeah.
And why is everybody looking at me right now? Yes, that's not exactly an easy question to answer, but for me, Decolonise and Decarbonise, at the core, we have an issue of power. Who has it, and who controls the resources, and in whose interest they are produced and consumed and taken. So it's essentially a matter of changing the structures of power between the genders, between races, between areas of the world, and inside countries, between groups. We have, you mentioned indigenous people in India. We have the same issue with indigenous people who bear the brunt of the inequalities of colonization and carbonization, because they're both victims of the relations of power created by the original colonization, but also the resulting modes of production and sexualized mode of production. So that would be power, is my answer.
Talking about carbon reduction can, as I was saying earlier, can very easily go hand in hand with kind of larger neoliberal kind of ideas of fighting climate change. So, I mean, I think it has to be larger and more critical conversations about where power lies in society, how our identities carry this power, and so yeah, it has to be. We have to talk about it intersectionally in terms of not just the history of colonization, but how it continues. States that were nations that were initially colonized, how they continue to colonize their own people. So yeah.
Thank you.